competing industries, but if we're opening up additional trade possibilities in other countries, exporters stand to gain. So by lowering trade barriers, we hurt well-organized, perhaps well-politically connected import-competing industries, but as a counterweight to that, we've now brought in domestic exporters who are all also financially concentrated and probably also reasonably politically connected. So it's the exporters that we need as a counterweight to the import-competing industries, not trying to organize the consumers. Okay, so with that just as a thought, let's just think about trade agreements in general. Now, trade agreements have been in place for gazillions of years. I mean, literally gazillions. First trade agreement in recorded history goes back to something like 3500 BCE, so 5,500 years ago. So, but what we're interested in is what's happened somewhat more recently. The big collapse, the first big collapse in world trade happened during the 1930s in the aftermath of the United States adopting the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. This increased tariff rates quite dramatically in the United States. It did not cause the Great Depression. It couldn't, since the Great Depression actually started before Smoot-Hawley was passed. However, it did cause a significant shrinkage in international trade, and that presumably aggravated the Great Depression. We know that trade volumes in the United States went down sharply, both exports as well as imports. Now, the reason behind the Smoot-Hawley Act was we were in the Depression. Unemployment rates were rising very quickly. The idea was if we could keep out imports, we'd have to make it ourselves, and that means we put a lot more people back to work. Well, that would make sense if you could sustain the exports that you had. But it turns out our major trading partners, Canada being the first, said, whoa, time out. If you're going to put tariffs on our imports from Canada, we're going to put tariffs on imports from the United States. So Canada raised tariff rates, England raised tariff rates, France, Germany, and we had a global ratcheting up of tariff rates and a big collapse of international trade. When Roosevelt was elected in 1932, they recognized the bad deal that was there, and they started with a series of bilateral tariff negotiations, primarily with Canada and the UK. And so we sent trade representatives to both those countries to talk about this. This was slow going because we don't have uniform tariffs, so every negotiation had to be across a wide range of products and a wide range of industries. Some progress was made in this, and tariff rates between Canada and the United States and the UK and the United States started to come down in the late 1930s. The whole process, of course, was interrupted by World War II. So after World War II, a decision was made that rather than do bilateral, let's see if we can do some multilateral trade negotiations. Let's bring together a group of countries. It turned out to be 23 countries, European, Canada, basically Europe, Canada, and the United States. They set up an agreement known as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is referred to as the GATT. And these were basically the trade rules, the organization that, excuse me, I shouldn't say that. It was not an organization. It was a treaty. So it was an agreement that the signatories to this agreement agreed to abide by the provisions that were in here. And the GATT basically had two ways of trying to bring down tariff rates. The first was it had levers, which were ways of pushing down the tariff rates, and it also had ratchets, which were an attempt to keep rates from climbing again. So the ratchet part is pretty easy to understand. It simply said, within the negotiations themselves, as we brought tariff rates down, we would also bind them. This process of binding created a ceiling for the tariff rate. So if you were underneath your bound rate, you could raise it, but you could not raise it above the bound rate. For the initial set of countries, their tariff rates were their bound rate, so that there was no possibility of backsliding for them. So again, a bound rate is simply one in which tariff rates could not rise above that level in the future. There were also, of course, all sorts of non-tariff barriers, things like import quotas, voluntary export restraints, export subsidies, and there was an attempt to try to eliminate these as well. For import quotas in particular, the attempt was convert the import quota to a tariff, right? Find the equivalent tariff rate, and then we could use our levers and binding to negotiate those rates down as well. There were also agreements, no new import quotas. Hasn't always been so strictly enforced. Export subsidies we're talking a lot about, but not much was done. The lever for pushing rates down were groups of negotiations that were typically referred to as trade rounds. And there have been a whole bunch of trade rounds that have gone on. The first 5 were parallel bilateral negotiations, which only meant that each country negotiated with every other country individually, but at the same time. It was really kind of messy. It required a much larger conference room than actually getting everybody in the same room. But it actually worked pretty well. Tariff rates were pretty high at the end of World War II, so bringing them down was something that was not all that difficult to accomplish. It was also the case that there were actually relatively few countries involved. Remember, GATT was set up. The original signatories numbered 23. The 6th round was what was known as the Kennedy round, initiated by President Kennedy, completed in 1967, and gave us a 50% reduction in tariff rates of most of the major industrial countries. There were very few emerging markets involved in GATT in these early rounds. The second round was the Tokyo round, completed 12 years later. In fact, the Tokyo round began within a year of the Kennedy round being completed. So they kicked it off right away. And again, the whole idea was to reduce tariffs. And in this case, they were also trying to deal with non-tariff barriers as well. The 8th round was the Uruguay round, completed in 94, and had really 2 major areas that it looked at. How do we liberalize trade? And can we have some administrative changes that would expand the areas in which trade negotiations could deal with? So on the liberalization side, more tariff rate reductions, about 40%. Now remember, we've been reducing tariff rates through 7 previous rounds of negotiations. The Kennedy round in itself cut those tariff rates in half. So yes, the Uruguay round reduced rates another 40%, but rates in most of the industrialized countries were very low to begin with. So another 40% of a very low rate really isn't that big a change in tariff rates themselves. There were also some significant movements in 2 areas that had been very stubborn to get agreements on, agriculture and clothing. Now, it actually turned out clothing, they made huge progress subsequently, and in agriculture, the progress is still faltering. So not much that was gone on there. There were also new rules about government procurement, most of which have not been followed. But government procurement just says the governments need to open up the markets where they buy goods and services for imported goods as well as domestically produced goods. So the most important thing probably is the transformation of the GATT into the World Trade Organization. So remember, the GATT was the general agreement. It was simply a treaty that you could sign on to or not sign on to. There was no formal organizational structure, although there was a secretariat and a staff and people who worked there. They all moved over to the WTO in 1995. So the WTO is indeed a full-fledged international organization. But the GATT only talked about goods, trade barriers on goods, where the WTO was expanded to include both services and intellectual property rights. The big part of the WTO, or probably the most effective part from a trade perspective, is the dispute settlement process. GATT was started in 1947 or 1948 and ran to 1995. There were trade disputes that were being appealed under the GATT system for over 25 years without resolution. So this became a major problem. One country would accuse another country of some sort of illegal or non-agreement trade policy, and they would take it to the GATT for resolution. And it would be fought out by the lawyers forever and ever. And the average settlement period was 7 years. Under the WTO, the dispute settlement process is targeted to be completed in 12 months. So that a panel of experts is put together, trade experts and industry experts, is generally brought together very quickly to hear the case, render a preliminary ruling, generally within 6 months, allowing for appeals from the aggrieved parties, and then a final resolution inside of 12 months. It's actually worked quite well. With very few exceptions, most trade disputes get settled very, very quickly. Now, of course, remember that the WTO does not have a police force. It does not have an army, so it actually has very limited enforcement rights. So it is in the WTO's purview to tell a country that they're breaking the rules of the international trade agreements that the country has voluntarily agreed to when they joined the WTO. But if they decide not to change their behavior, there's not a great deal the WTO can do to force a change in behavior. It does, however, allow the harmed country to take legal trade policy actions in response to that. So if a country has been ruled to illegally be subsidizing its exports, the importing country, and doesn't change its behavior, the importing country will be granted a waiver to apply tariffs against that subsidized product. If a country is found to be dumping illegally under the WTO rules, and does not change its behavior, then the importing country will be granted a waiver to apply a tariff against those dumped products. Now, I said countries, but remember, it's actually business firms who are engaged in the international trade, but the enforcement has to be done by the business's government. Okay. Well, like we've said before, most of the costs of the Uruguay round were very highly concentrated in very well-organized groups, and the benefits were widely diffused, producer surplus, consumer surplus. So, of course, there's been a great deal of fear and reaction to what the WTO or the Uruguay round actually accomplished. The annual benefits were expected to be about $200 billion when it was fully implemented. It's been more than fully implemented by now. The benefits, as best we can measure those, actually seem to be about twice as large as the $200 billion that was actually suggested. Given the protests that were taking place, it was actually somewhat surprising to many observers that anything passed. The authors would suggest that one of the reasons that it passed anyway was fear of a protectionist backlash if it failed. That concept was actually quite popular up until about 3 years ago. And 3 years ago, what we saw was basically the collapse of the next round of trade negotiations, the 9th round, which is called the Doha round, which has basically collapsed and failed. And of course, this has also happened during a rise of protectionist sentiment, not just in the United States, but pretty much around the world. So I'm not sure that this fear of the consequences of not passing something really make much of a difference. Now, one of the things that all of the WTO, and for that matter, GATT agreements require is that all trade agreements must be non-discriminatory amongst the parties involved. So what that means is that within a trade negotiations, countries are given what is known as most favored nation status. So if the U.S. decides it is going to lower its tariff rates on imports from Canada, which, by the way, is Canada is actually not a good example. Let me pick another example. If the U.S. is going to lower its tariff rates on imports from Brazil, a member of the WTO, it must also reduce tariffs on the same products from any other country who is a member of the WTO. Every member of the WTO is given most favored nation status because they are members of the WTO. So you have to, when you change your tariff rates, have this non-discriminatory policy. There is, however, one huge exception to that, and that is countries can establish what are known as preferential trading agreements. Essentially what this says is the U.S. and Brazil could enter into a preferential trading agreement and have different tariff rates between themselves than all the other members of the WTO if, and only if, the tariff rate on imports between Brazil and the United States is zero. That is, if we create a free trade area, then we do not have to apply that zero tariff rate to all the other members of the WTO. So it's just generally a bilateral, but sometimes multiple countries can be involved in creating these free trade areas where you get rid of all your trade. Generally, you're negotiating to get rid of all your trade barriers, but tariff rates in particular. So there's been a big push over the last 20 or 25 years for free trade areas to be established. One of the reasons for that is as the WTO has gotten larger and larger, we're up to 150 some odd countries now, to successfully conclude a trade agreement requires unanimity. Everybody has to agree. If there's a single holdout, no matter how big or how small the country is, the agreement will not pass. You'll notice that a lot of those trade agreements took a decade or longer to actually get done, in part because everybody gets a say and a vote in whether or not it's going to take place. Bilateral negotiations are obviously much easier because there are only two parties involved. So free trade areas can be, or preferential trade agreements can end up looking like two different areas. A free trade area is one. So the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, is a free trade area. Within a free trade area, there are not supposed to be any trade barriers or tariff rates between the imports and exports of the members of the free trade area. Each member, however, can have its own tariff rates against outside members. So for Canada, the United States, and Mexico, the tariff barriers between them were negotiated to go away over a very long period of time. They're mostly completely gone between U.S. and Canada and rapidly being phased out between Mexico and the United States and Canada. But each of those three countries can have very different tariff rates against China or Brazil or other countries that are not members of the free trade agreement. The second type of free trade area is what is known as a customs union. So the European Union is a customs union. Within the context of a customs union, all the countries agree to have the same tariffs against outside members, or outside non-members. I guess it wouldn't be members, right? So outside countries would all face the same tariff rate for every member of the customs union. So if you want to export a product to Europe, what you'll find is the tariff rate that is applied by Germany is exactly the same tariff rate that's applied by France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and all the other members. So we've got a uniform tariff rate against outside countries, no tariff rates on the inside. So that's a slight difference between the two. Administratively and politically, these two are also quite different. Free trade areas are pretty straightforward to negotiate. Generally, two countries, they just got to get together, make an arrangement, and do it. They're incredibly complex to actually administer. And one of the reasons for that is foreign exporters actually try to arbitrage different tariff rates. So if Mexico, for instance, has a much lower tariff rate on some item than the U.S., foreign exporters will want to send it to Mexico. But the product may actually be destined to be in the United States. So it needs then to be transshipped from Mexico into the United States. But there are no tariffs between Mexico and the United States. However, there are tariffs on imports into the free trade area that get applied for the United States. So if you go to the U.S.-Mexican border, you'll still see lots of border agents, customs agents, because everything that comes into the United States from Mexico, we have to find out, was it made in Mexico, or was it made in Brazil, or China, or Chile, or Australia? Where was it made? And then we got to figure out what tariff rate to apply to it. So administratively, it becomes very complex. It becomes even more complex if the product was imported into Mexico and then used as a component into a semi-finished or finished good. Because then when it gets transshipped to the United States, you have to figure out how much of the value added came from outside of the free trade area. And maybe even which countries it came from, if you had different tariff rates against different countries. So administratively, free trade areas can be incredibly complex. Customs unions turn that around just the opposite. Administratively, they're very easy. When it comes into the customs union area, a tariff is applied. Since every country has exactly the same tariff, you don't have to worry about trying to arbitrage the tariff rates from one country to another. The problem with customs union is each country is essentially giving up its own trade policy. And it's generally giving it up to some supranational or supra-country organization, the EU government, in the case of the European Union, which means the Germans and the French and the Italian and Spanish and so forth citizens and governments don't really have any direct input into the tariff rates that affect their own industries. So politically, customs unions don't jump into being very quickly, but once they're there, they're pretty easy to rule. So with all of the press that gets taken place about free trade areas or free trade agreements, the question is, are they good or are they bad? So President Obama just came back from Asia. One of his big goals on his Asian trip was to conclude, or at least agree to conclude, before the end of the year, a free trade agreement with South Korea. Didn't happen. The Bush administration, when it was still in power, negotiated a free trade agreement with Colombia, but it's never been approved by the Senate. It is a treaty between two countries, so it needs approval by the Senate. But the Senate has never voted on it. They haven't voted it up, they haven't voted it down. They just haven't voted on it. And so it's sitting there. But one of the questions we might want to ask ourselves is, even with all the proliferation of free trade agreements that they've been, are they good or are they bad? Do they increase national economic welfare or do they reduce it? Can we figure that out? And it turns out it depends upon whether these trade areas are what we refer to as trade creating or trade diverting. So trade creation is simply how much new trade is actually taking place. Trade diversion occurs when our imports are shifted from a non-member to a member country on the basis of differential tariff rates, 0 for the member country, something positive for the non-member country, rather than the underlying cost of the product. So let's see if we can't illustrate this with an example. Let's suppose that the U.S. can produce wheat for $4 and France can produce wheat for $6. And let's suppose that the UK is importing wheat and has a tariff of $5 on wheat. Okay, so here's the import demand curve for the UK. So this would be the export supply curve for the U.S. and would tell us